Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the Dunhuang Foundation. I am Julia Grimes, the Deputy Director of the Foundation. This is our third lecture in the Art, Environment, and Materiality Along the Silk Road series. And I'd like first to thank Professor Feng at Boston University, who expertly curated this series, as well as Aurelia Docknall, who assisted with all of our organizational details. It's now my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Sonya Lee. Sonya Lee is Professor of Chinese Art and Visual Culture at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. She is also Director of the East Asian Studies Center at USC. A specialist in religious art and architecture of China and Central Asia, Dr. Lee has published widely on Buddhist material culture in pre-modern times. She's the author of Surviving Nirvana, Death of the Buddha in Chinese Visual Culture, and Temples in the Cliffside, Buddhist Art in Sichuan. Dr. Lee has several ongoing research projects. One of them concerns climate change and burial practices during the Tang Dynasty. This project will be the first to introduce an ecological perspective on the study of Chinese tombs by focusing on the use of plastered murals and sancai, or three-colored ceramic sculptures. Another is a small-scale exhibition on the Silk Roads, which is slated to open at the USC Doheny Memorial Library this spring. It will feature 30-something objects from the library's special collections, as well as from USC Pacific Asia Museum, UCLA Library Special Collections, and LACMA, or the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The exhibition will provide the faculty and students involved with a unique opportunity to reassess the topic's history and contemporary relevance for a general audience. Dr. Lee received her PhD in art history from the University of Chicago. She's the recipient of multiple research fellowships from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Getty Foundation, the Luce Foundation, the Japan Foundation, the Jiang Jingguo Foundation, the Asian Cultural Council, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Professor Lee's topic this evening will be Lessons on Ecology and Sustainability from Cave Temples of Sichuan. Without further ado, please join me now in welcoming her.
Well, thank you so much, Julia, for this very generous introduction. I'd like to begin by thanking the Dunhuang Foundation, especially Julia and Chris, for the invite. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share with you some of the key findings from my new book. Temples in the Cliffside, Buddhist Art in Sichuan, published by the University of Washington Press at the very end of 2021. And I believe the book should be available very shortly through Amazon and other outlets. I think there's some glitches in the supply chain, and so the book was printed in South Korea, and it's on its way to North America right now. So I hope it will be available very soon. So as you can tell from the cover, the subject of this book is cave temples, a very unique type of architecture that have shaped the landscapes and cultures of Asia for over 2,000 years. Cave temples can be found in many different parts of Asia, as you can tell in the map I have at the bottom of the screen. So stretching from South Asian subcontinent through the Silk Road region, Central Asia, Western China, and some parts of Western Tibet, all the way into East Asia. You find cave temples in different parts of China, as well as in Korea and Japan, especially in Kyushu. So most of the sites were initiated by Buddhists for their practices, although quite a number of them are associated with other religions such as Hinduism, Jainism, and Taoism. So we'll just show you a couple well-known examples just to give you some visual aid, just for those of you who have not visited some of these sites. So here on the screens, I have two very well-known places in India, Central India, the Red Circle, Bhaja and Ajanta. And for many of you in the audience, the images on the left should be familiar to you. So Mogao Caves of Dunhuang, both inside and outside, and then also the Kizil Cave along the Northern Silk Road in the Kuta region. So, and of course, the topic for today, the cave temples in Southwest China, especially in Sichuan and Chongqing. So as you can see, cave temples are hybrid spaces that are at once natural and artificial. They were created when pictorial images were carved along a cliff face and then provided with some form of shelter to preserve the work from the ravages of time and the elements. So you can say they are outstanding examples of art embedded in nature, embodying the interaction of art and the environment in the longue durée. Cave temples are the product of a will to create and a commitment to preserve. So what I mean by this is that the creator of these sites try to achieve two goals in mind, when choosing a natural formation as the medium representation and also as the setting. On the one hand, they attempted to impose their will and their vision onto their surrounding and seek to transform that surrounding. But on the other hand, they also acknowledge the necessity to coexist with nature as well and its own logic of operation. So these two seemingly competing goals really distinguish cave temples from other forms of productions in material culture. Another important aspect of cave temples is their remarkable longevity. So some of the units in the South Asian subcontinent, such as Baja and Janta, were built at the turn of the Common Era 2,000 years ago, and that they're still standing today. Others, such as the ones you see on the screen in Southwest China, were built in the 12th and 13th centuries, although some of the ones on the left-hand side a bit earlier, 6th or 7th, even 8th centuries, and they're still very much with us today. So these, the two fundamental impulses to create in nature and also to coexist within it continued by later users through repair, renovation, and recreation. Because they continue to evolve with the immediate environment and the people who stake claims to them, it's really hard to put a clear date for the beginning or the end date to the life of these sites. And I would like to call attention to one more aspect of cave temples, which is also crucial to my discussion today. And that has to do with their perceived religious power. And that's closely linked to the natural setting. So the mountain location underscores the liminal space they occupied. It signals a kind of intermediary zone between civilization and wilderness, something which allows humans to establish a foothold at the borders of what I call the uninhabitable. So the use of pictorial images of religious deities and all these fantastical beings help define the site as such, while enhancing their perceived magical power. So understanding the allure of cave temples across time is really important. It helps us to see why these sites continue to hold a very special place in contemporary society. I would call cave temples a type of dialogical transcendence in real space, because they have the power to enable the users to see beyond the here and the now. So when we go visit those sites, we somehow don't think about what they are today, but in fact, they actually take us on a journey to somewhere else. And I borrowed this concept from President Duara's very important argument on Asia's contribution to the world's sustainable future, because he also emphasizes that Asia has all this enduring religious traditions. So when we think about some of these pressing issues related to climate change and sustainability, religion, it actually is a really important factor to consider. So as you can tell from all these salient features about cave temples, they do offer us quite a number of important lessons on ecology and sustainability. and they can also help us to rethink some of the challenges we face as a society today. So to better flesh out what these lessons entail, I will begin with an explanation of the term Anthropocene. I assume some of you have heard the term, but some of you have not, so to be on the same page. So let me just walk you through it a little bit. So the term roughly refers to a geological time that we live in, and it began roughly about 300 years ago, and we still live in the Anthropocene today. So on the screen to the right-hand side, you have this very generic table showing you different geological epochs or eras. And up to fairly recently, I would say up to about the year 2000 or just around that time, the age that we live in today is called Holocene, which began about 10,000 years ago. But then there were a bunch of climate scientists who coined the term or popularized them. The most important among these climate scientists was someone named Paul Crutzen. And so he wrote a number of very influential, even though very short essays about the Anthropocene and then define it. So basically, what distinguishes this epoch from all others is that human activities related to industrialization, urbanization, population growth in the past 200-300 years have led to chemical, physical, and biological changes to the Earth's atmosphere, land surface, and oceans on a scale not seen before. The release of greenhouse gases, increase in natural disasters, loss of biodiversity, increase in social inequalities, and the drive toward artificial intelligence and synthetic life forms are all sort of consequences of these human activities. And so we are very familiar with these terms now. And so, so it's a very influential concept that we still are grappling with. So I have a couple pictures on the screen just to help you better understand all these geological times. So, so I put the big arrow pointing to the very end of Holocene, just to mark where the Anthropocene demarcates. And for those of you in the audience who'll be wondering about what about humans or about dinosaurs, how did they fit? So humans came about or evolved to where we are roughly during the last ice age. The epoch before Holocene was Pleistocene, and that's the last ice age, which began roughly 1.8 million years ago. And then with some warming of the planet Earth around 10,000, hence the beginning of Holocene. So we are on this very long warming trajectory. Now, I know that some of you are wondering about dinosaurs. Actually, they don't really fit within this diagram. And in fact, they disappeared from the Earth about 65 million years ago. But I know that since I get these questions from students all the time, how do humans and dinosaurs fit with each other? And I have to explain that. And so they actually were active on planet 200 million years ago, and then they disappeared about 65 million years ago. And so humans are pretty recent arrival on this planet. So I hope by now you get a little sense of what the Anthropocene is about. So let me talk a bit more about the implications. So, so now we have a very robust discourse on the Anthropocene in the last 20 years, and it's still evolving. So one of the really big takeaway from it is the realization that humans are considered a geophysical force capable of changing the climate of the planet. And I think this is actually quite a astonishing realization. And I think it is actually have a very profound impact on how we do scholarship today. And so this is actually one of the central questions that I grappled with in this book. And in order to really dive into all the implications, ramifications surrounding this, concept, one of the things I'm trying to do is to really rethink two key relationships in using pre-modern Asian perspectives. So one has to do with the relationship between nature and society. And then another has to do with that between human and non-humans. And I use examples from cave temples to not only grapple with them, but also put a distinctive non-Western perspective, because when you read the literature, even you go back to some of the writings by these climate scientists who propose and popularize the term Anthropocene, it's incredibly Eurocentric and also presentist. So basically they mark the beginning of the Anthropocene with the industrial age in Europe. And of course, they never talk about other things. And they mentioned a couple of times that pre-modern societies don't matter within this kind of scheme because the scale is not quite the same. And I disagree with them. And that's why I use a lot of the material from pre-modern Asia to actually make a counterpoint, to make a kind of argument that in fact they do matter, and that we do actually have a lot to learn from them. And so cave temples become one of those instances. Now, how do we link the cave temples to a lot of the developments that people are very concerned about, industrialization, population overgrowth, and so on and so forth? And I think one underlying common denominator has to do with technology. And the case that I will talk more about later today is the Colossal Buddha. And actually many of the technologies involved in building Colossal Buddha were appropriated from land transformation techniques used for agriculture and other purposes for development. And so technology plays a huge role. And it also gives us a lot of food for thought about the role of technology in society, how we deal with problems or come up with solutions. So again, technology is a really important part of how we talk about the Anthropocene. And the point I'm trying to raise through this study is that if we look at not just different forms of human exploitation of natural resources, but in fact to expand beyond that, to look at cultural enterprises, cultural productions, and there are actually more connections than you think. And so I think having this kind of more holistic overview of how labor distribution of knowledge exchange took place in modern and also pre-modern societies really help us to develop a different kind of frame of mind, which is actually very crucial for coming up solutions for many of the problems we face today. And one term that you see also here has to do with green Buddhism. So Buddhism has been part of environmentalism for a very long time. And in fact, it was many concepts in Buddhism, such as no self or non-duality, have been appropriated by leading proponents of what we call the ecology movement in the 60s and 70s and 80s. People like Gary Snyder or Joanna Macy, all these really big names in deep ecology use many different forms of Buddhism. But then I think they also play along with some of these underlying assumptions that Buddhists are nature lovers, they don't cut trees, they love nature. But actually, in the last 20, 30 years, we actually come to a very different understanding of what Buddhists did with the environment. And I also very much inspired by the work of my colleague, Johan Elbeskov, who wrote a book on the environmental history of Asia and actually provide very different picture of Buddhists, how they actually cut trees and, do all kinds of things to exploit natural resources. And at least from my perspective, I think material culture also help us to go beyond this kind of green Buddhism type of romanticization, because I think material culture provides all kinds of perspectives into people who didn't write the records, and we get a glimpse of their presence and even a little bit of their mindset through their devotional activities. So say they contributed, whatever they had to the making of some Buddha images. And so through the study of these images, we actually got a glimpse into them. And so it's really important that we try to uncover these forgotten voices from non-elitist background through the study of material culture. And so that's another major way that cave temples can help us to get more perspectives from the pre-modern period. So far, I have spoken about the connection to the Anthropocene discourse. So there are also quite a few lessons that cave temples can offer in terms of sustainability. So let's turn to that now. So for those of you who are familiar with how we talk about sustainability today, it's pretty much about what we do now, just to make sure that we leave enough for the future generation in terms of social and economic terms. So what I have on the screen basically demarcate the temple framework in which a lot of these ideas about sustainability have been discussed. So it's really about now and the future. But then the past is completely missing. And I think that's something that a lot of us who work on pre-modern periods can step in and actually say that it needs to be broader. So I come up with the second point here, mainly, you need to look at sustainability, but starting with the past. And then, of course, all these things that we learn from the past can inform us how we deal with the present, and also how to project and anticipate the future. And so, so this book is one of many efforts now by many of us working on pre-modern periods to try to give a voice and actually make it very loud and clear that cultural monuments from the past do matter, and they actually have a lot to offer when we confront a lot of problems we have today. And more specific to cave temples is that a lot of the things that we talk about today, what people try to sustain, preserve, and also save for the future, can be understood from different perspectives. So in this book, I focus in particular on three stakeholder groups. So you have the managers, because they understood sustainability, or a very different term in the past. One is they try to preserve, one is to try to uphold at those sites, very differently than, say, visitors or the people who actually did the restoration and the repair. And so it's three very distinctive groups, and with those ideas about what they're trying to achieve through their work, and how to preserve what they consider to be so important and pass them on to for the future generation. And so so you see these three groups at work, but I will not talk as much about them because there won't be enough time. And then the third point that I would like to call attention to, I think this is also much closer to my own contribution, has to do with a methodology that I developed through this project, and that's what I call ecological art history. Now, the term may be a little confusing because some of you are aware of how a lot of contemporary artists are dealing with issues related to climate change and ecological problems of sustainability in their work. And their work is often known as eco art, the second part. And so the history about these works can be called eco art history. But what I'm talking about here is a lot bigger, because I'm not talking about any, I would say maybe just one tiny section in my book about things happening right now, the brand new works being created with the intent to address very specific ecological issues. So I'm talking about a methodology that's really trying to uncover and explicate the potential in earlier works. It's just that people didn't use the same terms or use the same concept that we have today, but some of these similar issues were already there, and they're dealing with them, but in very different ways. And so ecological art history is one thing that we could do more as a discipline in art history. And that's something I also had in mind while writing this book, that it's not just about the content itself, but also a methodology. And because my subject is cave temples, and so there are very specific things that this subject can contribute. So I will talk about those in just a minute. But the second point is that because in art history today, there's so much interest in just getting beyond what we have in the canons and to really to look at things on a global scale. So I see ecological art history as part of, or as a different, another form of global art history. And it's a way for us to really trying to level the playing field and really aim for something that share this common vision of diversity, that we need to hear a lot more about these forgotten voices, that we need to hear about things that happen outside the sort of the center for Western art history, and to look outside. And so using cave temples, it's certainly a way for me to get at some of these issues. And so it's something that I hope will inspire other people to do. And it's also a type of historical analysis that's not limited to one time frame, as I mentioned earlier, because it's so hard to put a beginning or end date to the site. And so the purview of my analysis stretches from prehistory of a site all the way to contemporary times. And it's very challenging to do this kind of work. And then of course, it all depends on the type of evidence that we use. And so for this project, in case you're wondering what kind of evidence I'm drawing on, and I will actually do a demo for you by talking about one specific case, just to show you how I use my evidence. So the site itself is my primary focus, and also its pictorial content. So the kind of things that I rely on. So what we can see today, and there's actually a lot you can say based on what you can observe today. But of course, you wonder about what happened like 1,000 years ago. How do we get how do we reconstruct the site 1,000 years ago? Then you need to draw in other things. And so one body of evidence that I draw on has to do with textual records of all sorts. So inscription found at the site. You also have a lot of information in local gazetteers. You have you have geographical text, and you also have travel logs, people who went there and they left behind the writings. And sometimes these writings are in poetic form, so they are in actually collections of poetry, essays. So a lot of things that you can look for. And sometimes the writings left at the site were actually excerpts from Buddhist texts. So Buddhist scriptures also play an important role. One of the many texts that I look at. Now, to also get at the physical properties of, say, the stone or the images, I rely on technical studies, a lot, conservation reports if they're available. And for modern periods, there are also more texts such as policy documents, memorandums, official annals, news reports. So a lot of the things that are actually available online. And and then the third type of materials that I look at, evidence that I draw on, pertains to interviews that I conducted with people who are working on those sites today, and also ethnographic observations of select subjects, things that you can do today. And then you can slowly project how far these practices went back in time by looking at other resources. So you constantly corroborate different types of evidence to create a more complete picture. And so I'm talking more like in the abstract, so I hope things will become clearer when I give you an example. So just to walk you through very quickly through the table of contents. So there are all kinds of restrictions on what you can do, you can write 1,000 pages, but it doesn't mean that the publisher would do it for you. So I'm sort of constantly living under the pressure from the editor to cut it down. And so, and 5 chapters, but I hope that that's enough to work out, to articulate some of these lessons that I lay out earlier, and also give coherence to the project. So as you can see, divided book into 2 parts, because my concept of ecological art history is really about what the environment, what role it has in shaping the site and its design. And then when you flip it around and think about, once the site was established, what impact it has had on its users in terms of their thinking about and also interaction with nature. And so these 2 basic questions help divide the book into 2 parts. So in the first part, it's really about the role of environment shaping the site, and it play out in what I call some sort of inner and outer dynamics. So physically, so like at Loshan, there's always something about looking in, but also sort of the inside and the outside, and then constantly flipping around. And then it can also apply to some sort of social organization. So the second chapter is more about how a particular group of users at the site of Baotingshan and use the site as a healing center. And to say that I did a lot of revision of this during the pandemic, and this book is really about diseases and epidemics. And so it's more than timely. I think it's just sometimes too much to think about all this while you're actually experiencing a pandemic around you. And in the second part of the book, it's about the 3 stakeholder groups that I lay out. So it's really about the reception, or how people use the site and how the site changed or shaped the way they approach interactive with nature. And so you have the site managers, visitors, and the restorers. And then I have a postscript to cover some of the cave temple sites actually being built in the last few decades. So things are still happening right now. And some of you might be wondering about why Sichuan. Well, there are actually a couple of factors. So I would say that you can apply a lot of things that I said to different regions, and you can do similar type of studies. And so I did that with just Southwest China, in part because it's a very, it has its own unique ecosystem and also culture. And this self-contained nature of the region is shaped by the fact that there are a lot of tall mountains to the north, to the west, to the south, and it's only mainly accessible through the Yangtze River. And within Sichuan, I think the very name itself says it's 4 rivers. So so the Yangtze River, and then there forms the main course access, and then there are all these tributary rivers flowing north-south. So those are the ones, and many of the sites that I focus on in this book are located along the rivers, like Lushan and Bazong. Those are some very interesting links to the river. And so that's one point. And another has to do with the historiography of the history of the field. And for a very long time, a lot of scholars have focused on the Silk Road regions of Dunhuang, and it's also central China and northeastern China, but not so much about the south, so to speak, both in China and also outside China. And so it's certainly an opportunity for me to focus on that. And my colleagues in Southwest China have been extremely generous in sharing their insights with me, and they welcome people from the outside to really work in the region. So that's another really big factor for me to focus on it. And for those of you who've been to Southwest China, you know that there are certain things that you always associate with Sichuan. Humidity, because it's such a watery region. there's so much water, so that means it's so much humidity. And so it certainly plays a huge role in how we think about sustainability. How do you preserve a site with so much humidity around you? And so I address that in that chapter about restorers. And so even though you have the most sophisticated or even perfect adhesive you can find, just to stick things back on, but it might not work in such a humid area. So you need to find something that's eco-compatible. And so eco-compatibility is a big concept that I deal with in that chapter. And so just a quick note. So those of you who are new to Southwest China, currently there are actually two parts. So the Sichuan province, so I label as such, and then that also the self-administered region called Chongqing. But before 1997, that's when Chongqing was separated from Sichuan. In pre-modern times, especially, we're talking about just one region, Sichuan. And so so that's why my book just have the name Sichuan, and of course the editor wanted shorter. So, okay, so forget about Chongqing. So so that's why I didn't include that in the title. So just for those of you who are just wondering about why there's only Sichuan, not Chongqing. Now, in the past, I just want to say this region is also known by two names, Xu and Ba. So Xu, it's the part to the west. Basically, the here you have the Chengdu Plain, pretty much the western part before you hit the mountains. And then the eastern part is called Ba, and including parts of Chongqing today. And so you often hear about Suba culture, and then another two Chinese characters closely associated with them would be Chuan and Yu. Chuan meaning the same character as Sichuan, Chuan, and then Yu is another ancient name associated with what we call Chongqing today. And so they all mean the same place. So just don't get confused. Sichuan, Chongqing, Xu and Ba, and then Chuan and Yu. Okay, so it's just a very basic terms. I see that I need to move along. And so in order to demonstrate or put a lot of these ideas I discussed earlier into practice, I will just focus on one example. And I've been using this in the announcement for this talk, so I will talk about Leshan. So I don't want to disappoint anyone if I focus on Leshan. It's a very famous site. Some of you might have been there. So since it's quite familiar to many of us, so I sort of like to throw a curveball by asking a rarely asked question, and that's at the bottom of the screen. Was the making of the Leshan Buddha a form of anthropogenic activities? It's like, wow, what are you talking about? So maybe just start with the term anthropogenic, and it is the term that you hear a lot. Basically, it's really about human impact on the environment. So when you drive a car, you turn on the gas stove, it's going to generate greenhouse gas, and so that will end up in the atmosphere, and so that's a kind of anthropogenic activity. Now, so I think this is pretty common these days to talk about all that, but what about pre-modern monuments? Can we really actually talk about those in these terms? And I say yes, and I actually throw it out and see how we get there. Now, before we answer this question, there are quite a few things that we need to know about Leshan. And so earlier I mentioned that I use all kinds of text just to sketch out what it was like, sort of its history. And it turned out that there's actually quite a lot. And the Buddha is, but let me just show you the geography and then talk about the text. So, so it's located at the confluence of three rivers. So if you look at the map, you see that it's located right here. And the Min River is the main river, but then two other rivers join in, the Qingyi and then the Dadu, and then they just flow into the Min River at this point, and then at the very point where all three rivers meet, that's the Leshan Buddha. And this is a picture that I took while on a boat, and then this is the Leshan Buddha is located right there. And so the green arrow demarcates where the boat is heading. And so that sort of gives you a sense. And as you can see, this is pretty challenging to navigate on this river because the water flows very quickly, and if not careful, if the boat capsize, you're in deep trouble. And in fact, the geographic conditions actually provided the reason why the Buddha was built. And the reason, how we learn about all this, it's from this text. It's actually an inscription left behind by one of the creators of the site, someone named Wei Gao. It's called Record of the Great Maitreya Buddha Statue at Lingyun Monastery of Jiazhou. So Jiazhou basically means Loshan. That's the name of the prefecture. And then Lingyun Mountain is basically the name of that mountain where the Loshan Buddha is located. And and so the text survived. It was actually rediscovered in the 80s, but before all that, it was preserved in a number of local gazetteers and other geographical texts. And so we actually have a fairly good version, and the fact that it was discovered and then the scholars actually compared to these previous editions, it's pretty much the same text. There's just some variations. And so from this text, we actually learned that the Loshan Buddha was built over 100 years, on and off, over the course of 100 years. So it was started by a monk named Haitong, who was a wandering preacher from Guizhou, and he arrived at the site because he noticed that a lot of people lost their life while navigating through this region. As I mentioned, it's pretty tough to navigate when the river flows so rapidly, and so he had compassion for those life lost, so that so he wanted to build a Buddha to calm the water. So that's actually from that text. And so he initiated the project sometime in the 720s and 730s. And by the time he died, the text said that only the head was completed. And then the project was abandoned for about a decade or so. And then a major patient came along, and this person is named Zhang Xiujianqiong, and he was the military governor of Sichuan. So he's the top-ranking official in the entire region, not just Loshan. And he took interest in this project, and he built a lot of it. And much of what I'm going to talk about today actually happened under him. Okay, and the third person, and he was around only for a short period of time, so just a few years, and then he left because he got a promotion in the capital, and then he died shortly afterward. So again, the project was abandoned. So only upper part of the body was completed, and then it was abandoned for many decades. And then another major patient came along, someone named Wei Gao, and he's another major political figure. So he's another military governor sent to this region. And Wei Gao has a lot of power because he succeeded in pacifying this whole region. And for those of you who know a bit about Tang history, will know that the Tang Dynasty sort of had a major breakdown in 755. And then after that, all kinds of unrest. And then there's also security threats from neighbors, such as the Tibetans, the Nanzhao kingdoms, and so on and so forth. So Wei Gao was sent in to pacify the region, and he did it. And he also took interest in the Loshan Buddha, and he completed it pretty much. So this is all the information we learned from this text. Now, so besides the in situ inscriptional records, we also have all kinds of records about Loshan Buddha from later visitors. So this is a particularly well-known excerpt. It's written by Feng, a very well-known scholar official who was stationed in Sichuan, and he was about to leave. And so he took this very elaborate boat trip. I guess it's like a pre-modern version of the Yangtze River cruise. So he did that, and then wrote about all the sites he visited. So he wrote about the sites in Sichuan because that's the starting point, and then you went all the way back to the Jiangnan area. And so while in Leshan, he spotted this amazing Buddha, and this is basically James Hadger's translation of the text, Diary of a Boat Trip in Wu. And so he actually gives you some very specific numbers. So this is 362 high, it's 10 down wide in terms of how big the heads and the eyes are. And then there used to be a multi-story structure in front of it, and it's the largest Buddha in the world. I don't know how it came up with that, but certainly pretty big. And it's the most stunning view that he ever seen in this whole part of the world. So it's pretty high marks from Pantanda. And we also have pictorial evidence of the site, and it's from this really great painting in the Fair Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., 10,000 Li along the Yangtze Rivers, and very, very long paintings, like 16 feet long, very long. And in their earliest section, and you see that depicted right here. So, and then here is the Jiazhou or Leshan back then, and then Ormeishan is in the back. So how do we know all this? Because this painting is actually a geographical painting, or it's like almost like a map of labels. And so if you look more carefully, you see these red characters, right? And then they actually label them. And so just in case you didn't quite able to read, so Nine Peaks Mountain, that's another name for this part of location. And then the Great Buddha right here. So it was covered up by all these multi-stories. And then the real mountain is this little island, and I have it in my earlier map. So we have all this pictorial and textual evidence. Now, based on those, you actually can get a pretty good sense of what it might have looked like. And just to help you, I did this very crude reconstruction, because it's actually very important to have this multi-story shelter in mind when we think about Leshan in pre-modern times. And so the Buddha, it's quite hidden from view. And for a lot of these pre-modern visitors, you will take the boat and arrive in front and then climb up. And of course, this is the opposite of how you would visit Leshan today, because you're supposed to arrive near the top and then you slowly walk down and then you exit. So it was a very different view of how this site was understood in pre-modern times. Now, I will now move on and talk about how the site was constructed. So, so as I mentioned earlier, it was done in three stages. And one of the things that a lot of people ask about Leshan has to do with how tall the Buddha is, the height. And I can tell you from the latest round of measurements, it's 62 meters. And so it's roughly about 200 feet. So it's like a 10-story building. So it's pretty tall. And it's still one of the tallest Buddhas in the world. Now, but if we are trying to answer the initial question I asked, whether the making of the Leshan Buddha can be understood as some sort of anthropogenic activities, the height's not going to get us there. So instead, I would suggest to really focus on scale, and in terms of how much of the stone is being removed in order to create this sculpture. And so in order to get to that, I think it sort of shows you the enormity of that hole being dug out from this mountain. And so these are the pictures showing you this enormous niche that the Buddha is sitting in. So I look at a lot of, there's a technical study done in 1989 to 1991. So it's a report. So there's a lot of discussion about the height, and then there's also a cross-section in there. So more recently, thanks to the development of drone technology, so there's more aerial photographs being taken of the site. So I brought the two together and created this diagram to show you how it looks from a bird's eye view and also from the cross-section. And once you get that, you can actually measure how much stone is being removed in order to create this niche, assuming that it was actually like pretty vertical in its original form. We have no way of knowing because it's just been so long. And so, so I did a little math here and calculated pretty much the amount of stone being removed. And that's pretty much about 77,000 cubic meters. And this is the imperial system conversion, so how many cubic feet. And more specifically, if you put the arrow here, basically indicates how much was actually done under the first military governor who did the job. So that's Zhang Qiu. And then the part done by Wei, which is basically from the hands down to the bottom, and then sort of divided up into two. So this is actually quite a very astonishing number that we have. So how do we make sense of these numbers then? Then I use a comparable example from a couple of hundred years ago, and that's Yungang Caves, where you have some of the also really famous Colossal Buddhas, first constructed in the 5th century, and the site continue on and also off for many centuries afterward. And the Colossal Buddhas are located in cave 16 all the way to 20. So here, just to show you the profile and also the cross section. And then this is the view that you get today from the outside. And in the late 80s and 90s, a Japanese scholar named Yoshimura Rei teamed up with a group of engineers from his school at Waseda University, did a really interesting study of how Yungang Cave were constructed. So here, just a page from that. And I think it's a way to show you the reductive method being used to build Colossal Buddha. So Leshan Buddha would have been very similar. And so you basically start, this is the slope of the mountain, and then you slowly dig it down so by creating these steps. So the workers will try to remove stones roughly 2 meter by 2 meter and 2 meter at a time. And then they built the slope until they were able to create this platform and then dig further in order to create this enormous interior space. So nothing that's actually added, and instead it's being taken out. So it's a reductive method that's very common that you actually have it since some of the earliest sites in India. It's the same method that's being used. And so they came up with all kinds of numbers. So to build 5 Colossal Buddhas, they removed about 23,900 cubic meters. So, okay. And then, they also calculated how many workers are involved, how many days it took, and at the rate of basically 2 people working as a team for a 10-hour shift. And then they calculate using metal picks and then trolleys, and wheelbarrows and things like that. So they were trying to really use the technology available today and calculate. And so it's actually a really important study for my work. And so I put the numbers together. And I think one thing that will be quite clear to you is that to build a Leshan Buddha, they have to remove 3 times the numbers, the amount of stone. So you can see it's like 3 times. And what makes the comparison viable is the fact that it's also sandstone, even though it's built a couple hundred years earlier. And of course, assuming that if you apply the same rate to the time and also the manpower, you can see that it will take 3 times longer and 3 times more of the workers. But of course, we know from other historical facts that's not possible because there's only 1.17 billion people living in entire Sichuan. I would say registered household, according to Tang records. So there's only, that seems impossible. And then in Jiazhou alone, there's only 34,000 registered households. So clearly, they did not have that many workers, and they did not work for 35 some years to complete this project. So what it means is that they have certain advantage actually being offered by technology. And so we go back to this record. We know that Jiang Qiong actually somehow is able to accomplish the job with fewer people and less time. And his trump card was actually technology. And he's actually known to be have done quite a number of large-scale public works in this area. And so in the chapter, I actually spent a lot of time talking about that whole history of water control technology in this whole area. And starting with Duzhangyan, and that's a really important site along the Min River, much further up north. And for those of you who know something about Sichuan, so the moment it became part of the Chinese Spear, the governor created this system by the person named Li Feng, and he was sent there to, turn it into a productive region. And the way to do it is actually calm the water. And that's how the system at Duzhangyan first began, and is still being in use today. So basically, when you look at the map more carefully, you see that the Min River is actually split into two at Duzhangyan. And so that's where that happened. And there's been a lot of technologies involved in land transformation, and then also in agriculture. And so Jiang Qiong actually inherited this whole tradition of land transformation and water control. And he actually put all of this into work for the making of the Loshan Buddha. And so that's how I explain he was able to do that with so fewer people and shorter amount of time. And another advantage that he had was that actually he didn't really need to remove as much stone, because there are actually a lot of cliff tombs already in the area. So I would say there's really no official count of how many cliff tombs there are at Loshan, but at least in the hundreds. So what I mean by this is that long before Loshan Buddha was made, people were creating burial sites at the mountain by creating these very long tunnels. And so here's this example showing you one. So basically, it's a very long tunnel deep into the mountain. And then it's a very crude interior. But I think the point to make is that you need some sort of drilling technology to do this. And so that is also available in this area. And also when Jiang Qiong came to this, there must have been a lot of these cliff tombs, and that means it saved him a lot of time. You just need to destroy these tombs and move the stone out. And another really advantage that he had was there's a long history of salt production, and that has to do with drilling. And so these technology might have come from that history of technology. And where here you have examples showing you people extracting salt from this brine. And so it's a kind of drilling, and Sichuan has a very long history of this kind of salt production. So all these things have to do with the history of technology at the site. And so when Haidong came, when Jiang Qiong carried on the project, they certainly carry on with these traditions. So now trying to think about whether the making of the Loshan Buddha can be understood as some form of anthropogenic activities. Let's move on and think of it in relation to agriculture. So when we talk about these activities, mainly economic activities, we like to think of input and output. And so in terms of input, the labor and also the resources involved are enormous, and it's actually bigger than anything that we have seen. And when you try to calculate or understand what people get from it, so I simply put the word intangible for the Loshan Buddha. Now, if you think about agriculture, it's very clear. So if you put in more people and more resources, so the output's gonna reflect that. And so you get better products, you get more crops, And that means more income. And of course, that means more population. So everything will keep increasing. And so, so it's very easy to measure. But when you try to apply, this kind of way of measuring the impact, the Loshan Buddha, it's very unclear. And I would say that the intangible has to do with something you cannot really measure. And yet the inputs, it's so significant that we really have to think about these two types of activities together in the same picture in order to really fully understand the impact of all these anthropogenic activities. And I think within this context, you can actually argue that, in fact, it can be understood as such. And in fact, we need to understand the construction or the making of major or massive cultural monuments in these terms. Not so much in a negative way, but in fact, what if, say, they diverted like tens and thousands of people away from growing more crops? Maybe in fact, actually is a positive impact on the environment. So I don't really have an answer to this, but I think the way we, as soon as we start to do this kind of analysis, I think there are actually a lot of really productive discussions. So maybe like some sort of cap and trade type of situation can understand, you're taking people away from producing, greenhouse gases. So maybe it sort of slow down the warming. So I don't know. I mean, I'm just throwing all this out with this example. And I see that I'm almost running out of time. So, and this question about technology is something that I've been thinking a lot about, because when we try to confront a lot of these climate challenges that we have today, oftentimes the solution is just to do more technology. So you can see that technology has led us to some of these problems, and to think of it also as a way to provide solution might not be enough. Maybe we need to sort of completely step back from this kind of thinking and try to understand how technology works. And so with cave temples, that actually a way, that's actually a very well-established trajectory for that. And so I don't have time to go into it, but I think I try to explore all these implications in the postscript by talking about some of the more recent sites. Like this one located in Nanchong, so it's eastern part of Sichuan, a site called Lingyunshan. And you can see that they've been trying to build this 100-meter tall Buddha. So it's even bigger than Loshan. So it's currently in progress. It's supposed to be done. But I think the main selling point for this project is that they're using a traditional technique. And if you look, you can see that people are actually cutting stone block by block and move them. So same technique. So you'd be wondering why they just don't use a giant, just blow it up using dynamite or something quicker. No, because in order to convey devotion, you need to use a traditional method. And so I think this is actually a really interesting example to think about this question of technology. And I'd be happy to talk more about this interest in the audience. So I will just end my talk here. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to comments and suggestions you have.
Sonya, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please, you can pop them into the bubble to the lower right-hand part of your screen. It says Q&A. And so with that, let's begin. First question, Sonya. First of all, thank you for elucidating how monuments such as that at Loshan can situate Asian art history within evolving discussions of ecology and sustainability. So how can this be expanded to other sites? I'm thinking specifically of the Mogao caves, as I often am, because there is a theory that they were also excavated from the top down, and the conglomerate rock was removed to hollow out these caves into which paintings and statues and other forms of decoration were then added. So might we also cite this excavation of Mogao, potentially, nobody's absolutely certain of how that, if it was done that way or not, but it is a good theory, as an anthropogenic activity.
Great. Well, I'm so glad, you're applying what I just said to other sites. I think that's actually the goal of the project. It's to get people to think about these old monuments in new light, especially in relation to the climate challenges that we have. And I would say that you need to really study the whole ecosystem around Mogao or even parts of Gansu very carefully, because the specifics will be different. And Mogao is located in a desert. I would say it's warming up, and also there's been all kinds of water problems. And I think one thing that has not been discussed as much is that it's in the middle of an earthquake zone, and the biggest worries is that there may be a major earthquake and the whole thing will be gone. So I don't know what would happen. I think, even Sichuan, yes, definitely, it's also earthquake zone. But I think there are things that you need to study, and I have not done that yet, but certainly it's very doable. And we can think about how the environment play a role in shaping the site. And Mogao is complicated because it has 1,000 years of history and involving different parts of the cliff. And so you probably have to divide up, whereas Loshan, it's a little more contained. And even though it's superimposed on a site where there have been a lot of burial chambers being built, the cliff tombs. So that's something that has not been discussed as much. I know there's been some excavation. There are actually a lot of tombs around the caves. It's just that a lot of them are looted, have not been properly documented. So that actually would have provided very interesting history to the prehistory of Mogao caves. So that's something we could look more into. And of course, when we move forward into the second part of my question, how the sites change the way we interact or think about nature, certainly tourism is a huge part. And in my book, I talk a lot about tourism. And so some of those things can also be applied too. And of course, tourism as part of the heritage system. So the two are intertwined so much that it's hard to just talk about one without the other. And different people, different stakeholders have different agendas. So for people in charge of the sites, of course, their job is to preserve them. But then, you have local businesses who want to develop, make more money, and they need tours. So how do we reconcile, balance these competing demands? So that's also a very big question. So it's actually been done. I think several years ago, Neville Agnew and Margaret Demas did this study on the sustainability of Mogao caves. It's actually a really, really important study because they calculated, how much oxygen or humidity that's been preserved if you let people in and walk out and close the doors and all this, right. And then they apply that to the site management, how many people you can allow on site at a given time and all this. I mean, it's been done. And so so different parts of, my narrative has been researched before. I mean, maybe the next step is just to fill in some of the gaps. And so that would be something I would suggest.
Excellent. Thank you, Sonya. It really opens up some new avenues in discussing, not just sites in Sichuan, but in other provinces or in other places around the world, even outside of China. Mm-hmm. So thank you. We have some questions coming in. The first is the Leshan Buddha location in Sichuan province outside of the traditional Silk Roads? So when we say Silk Roads, does that encompass this location, or is this considered to be outside it?
Let me maybe get the big map. Sorry, so I go back. Wait. If we think of the Silk Road as mainly land routes, the answer is no. But if you encompass the maritime routes, then maybe. And actually, yes, because maritime, there actually is a really important network in this area, basically Yunnan, Sichuan, and then parts of Southeast Asia. And so one could actually transport goods from this part of the world through here. So you can say, the goods coming in from Yunnan, it somehow ended up in Chengdu because of these rivers. And then you can actually take it through, and there's actually quite a bit of evidence. So in the early Tang Dynasty, there's a polity called Tuyuhun that ruled this part of the world, and then they actually were the gatekeepers of routes going into the northwest part of China. And so, of course, later on, you get the Tibetans, so it gets very complicated. And so, yes, if you think about the maritime routes, yes, you can link it to the Silk Road, but not through the more traditional overland routes.
Thank you, Sonya. Our next question is, why was Maitreya chosen as the Buddha to depict at the site?
Very good question. It's part of the earliest extant record we have, and I guess I don't like Maitreya, and he's a Buddha for compassion, because he's also exercising his compassion for people affected by the river. And so I guess they work as a team. And and I think there's also an interest in Maitreya in the early part of the Tang Dynasty. There's actually a lot of Maitreya. So like in Dunhuang, there's a big Maitreya Buddha.
So many.
Cave 96. And so yeah, so there's a strong interest in Maitreya in that part. So I don't know where he got the idea from, but that's what we got. But I think it certainly has to do with the compassion part of the story. And also Maitreya can exercise his compassion with power, great power, to calm the water. So that's all I can say without any further evidence. So but I think maybe it's part of this strong interest in Maitreya in early Tang that might have played a role. So that's my guess.
Yeah, in times of turbulence, a lot of people turn to Maitreya. So maybe if there was political turbulence or any other forms of just, I don't know, difficulty in people's lives, he would have been really appealing to appeal to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Our next question is, are the Buddhas you spoke about mostly made of sandstone in Sichuan province?
Mostly. Yeah, so it's a red sandstone. You find it throughout the whole region. And sandstone, it's so common in many different parts of China. And so, for example, when I talk about Yunnan Cave, even though it's pretty far, and it's a very different region, with all kinds of differences in terms of climate and all that. It's type of red sandstone, and it somehow have survived, even though this is a very watery type of landscape. Because as long as you allow the water to go through, to come out, you don't trap the water in, then the crystal structure will not change. Maybe unless you have a lot of salt in it.
Yeah, that makes good sense. At Mogao, that's definitely an issue.
Yes.
You need to keep that salt out. Salt is not good for your paintings or for your statues.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sonya. So our next question is from Anne. So Anne says, thank you for giving us an overview of your new book. Have you come across any challenges reading conservation studies? And second, do you have any suggestions for integrating conservation findings with the study of Buddhist art history?
Well, I wish all our historians have training in conservation, and I certainly learned the lesson hard myself, and I had to go back to school to learn those, because a lot of the things we look at have been fixed up by so many people before, just that they make it very subtle or they didn't even tell you. And so you have to train your eyes to be able to pick out that whole history, and try to, of course, you can judge what is good and bad, but but I think for me, I'm not specialized enough to be the judge, but I certainly see what people are trying to do, and then through these methods, there are actually a lot you can learn about about their mindset and what they're trying to do. So it's really about intent and purpose that we're trying to get at as historians. And so, but you need to learn the basics. So in this project, I spent a lot of time learning about gilding method. And I spent a lot of time talking to conservators or restorers today. Some of you know that at Baotingshan, there was a major conservation project that went from 2008 to 2016. And that was considered the #1 conservation project in China, the whole country. And so they spent huge amount of time as part of the project. Usually modern conservation, the first step is to really study what's there. And then from there, you try to find the methods to fix the problems identified. And so I spent all the time talking to these people and learn. And I think one really interesting outcome from that whole project is that they realized that the latest gadget, the latest techniques may not solve the problem. And you need to go back to some more traditional methods to do it. And so they decided to basically regild the Thousand-Arm Guanyin by using the traditional gilding method, and so using lacquer base. And so it turned out to be, they claim that, you know, it worked much better than using some adhesive imported from Italy because they tried it and didn't really last very long. Whereas if you use lacquer and do it the traditional way, then and the gold would actually stay longer. But of course, it's all relative. But I think the important part of that conservation project tells us about the eco-compatibility of material and methods. So that's something we need to pay more attention to as art historians. We have not talked about it. And I think in this project, because it has to do with environment, so I'm extra sensitive to those things. But you can apply a lot of these things to other questions and methods, I mean, other topics. So yeah, so this is certainly one benefit for getting to know conservation well for our work.
That's excellent. Sonya, the next question sort of comes off of that. Like, what were some of the most important things you learned from the conservators and the cultural workers at these sites?
I would say I have a very positive portrayal of them in the book. So I would say that the professionalism really sustained those sites because they're so serious about their work. And they spend hours, hundreds of hours, years, doing very thankless jobs. And because I think if you know friends or people who are engineers or do this type of hands-on type of work, you know, they work really hard because they take the job seriously. And so that's why I say there's professionalism really sustain the site. And that's really their legacy. And I see that with the colleagues I have today, because they spend so many hours doing really not so interesting things, you know, basically putting consolidant on a piece of rock so many times, you know, it's very mechanical, but they do it. And it's so cold in Daju in the winter, they have to do it outside. So I think that's something, the dedication to the work, it's really something I learned by getting to know these people, and also very practical in their way looking for solutions. So they're not dogmatic, you know, I have to use this adhesive because I like that company. But instead, you know, they want results. So they are very practical. And certainly they're not into, you know, these very abstract notions about piety or whatever. So those are maybe for the managers or the visitors. They're not being nostalgic about anything. They just want to get the job done. So I think that's actually very important for us to recognize.
So a high degree of professionalism and a high level of practicality as well, like what will serve the site best and the objects or artworks in it. Wow. Oh, that's really impactful to hear that. It reminds me of Mogao too.
Yes, so I think we are maybe influenced by their work ethics.
Yeah. It's really touching to see something like that, especially when people, as you mentioned, devote their whole lives to a single site, and just spend so much time there in relative isolation
Mhm.
from the rest of the world, just focusing on it in such depth.
And I also raise this question about sustainability because the Chinese government spends so much money on Baolingshan, and they keep spending money. So would that be an end to it? Say, what if the economy it's not growing at the rate that they like to say, so
Right.
they stop spending money? Then what will happen? So so how do you sustain, this constant need for maintenance? And so that's something that they have not resolved. So far, they've been over reliant on funding from the central government. And, in China, there's really no philanthropy to speak of. So even though now they have trained a whole group of people taking care of the site, but they need to eat, they need to get their salary, where are you going to find the money to pay them? So, and then there are so many problems, after fixing up the, one part of Baolingshan, there's still many other places you need to fix up. So is it sustainable to carry on all this really very high profile projects? Or are there ways to sustain it without spending so much money or needing so much? So these are the questions that have not been answered, and I think they don't have answer at this point. So, but I think definitely worth thinking about. So certainly at Mogao Caves, it's high maintenance, and so it has a very high position within the heritage management system in China. That might not change, but they may not get enough money. So how do you sustain it from the conservation point of view? So I don't know. That's a question for my colleagues at the Dunhuang Academy.
I mean, this is where it intersects with tourism as well, like questions of local businesses and tourists, like businesses that cater to tourists as well. So it's like, what route will people take? Right now, they can rely on support from the central government, but in the future, will that model change?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you. We have one more question. For the contemporary large Buddha statues in progress, like the one you showed at Nanchong, is the BAC, Buddhist Association of China, local temples or monasteries, are they involved? And what does their involvement or their non-involvement tell us about these religious statues?
Sure. Lingenstein is actually really important, very interesting. And I was doing research, let's try to find a picture. In Baolingshan, I asked Li Feng, if he knows any of sites that are being built, and he told me about this, and he called up the heads of the site. So I went check it out, and it's actually run as a tourism development project. So the CEO is a local businessman. He has many car dealerships. And but he did it as a labor of love because he and a bunch of local business people had a follower of this local master. I talk about that in my book, and someone named Yu, and he's the one who inspired them to do it, right? And so there's no Buddhist association involved. And actually, this site is what we call a site of three teachings. So it's both Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. And so he walked me through, if you have money you want to donate, they have a, I don't know what they call it, like almost like a catalog. Okay, so you have $2 million. You can build a giant Confucius statue if you want, or you want whatever, they have all of these laid out. So it depends on your budget. And but they would try to hire this group of carvers from Daju to do it. And so it's a site of three teachings, and then actually a huge part of it, it's actually about Taoism. There's a Taoist temple, and then they're also building 5-star hotels, all these amenities for people doing meditation, yoga, and whatever. It's a way to prolong your longevity. And so it's a really interesting combination of religiosity and tourism, and also economic development. And so, so I'm just showing you Colossal Buddha because it's kind of like Loshan, except this one's going to be bigger and taller. Maybe just taller, not bigger. And it's supposed to be 100-meter tall and with 10,000 bodhisattvas surrounding. And so you see a little bit of that. And you can technically donate just to have one of these bodhisattvas if you don't have a lot of money, or you can donate to the whole collective pot. And so, so it's a very strange, but there are also resonances you can find with the pre-modern situation. And so extremely entrepreneurial the way they run it, because the people involved at the top of the organization, all businessmen, they're very shrewd. They know how to run businesses and be successful, but they do it for this master that they follow. And so so this is a very interesting site, and I contrast that with something a bit more rural and people from lower economic background. So it's a very different type of situation, and yet people still want to do Buddhas in the landscapes. So so this is just a really interesting ongoing development.
It's fascinating. It reminds me of how on like Mount Chingcheng, they put in like a six senses, like luxury resort, and it ties into the Taoist practice on the mountain. So you are immersed in Taoism, but at the same time you were at the luxury resort and driven in there by, a Tesla or whatever. So I don't know, it fascinates me how you have this, religious practice, but at the same time, it's tied into very modern conceptions of tourism and luxury.
Yes, definitely. And I think a lot can still be done with all these new Buddhas. And the post-socialist China actually has most colossal Buddhas, even more than in the Tang Dynasty. I think that's the fact that not many people know about.
Alive and well. Oh, well, Sonya, thank you so much. This has been such an illuminating evening. I can't thank you enough for joining us tonight and for sharing the thesis and this entire new practice from your book, like new way of methodology of approaching art history. It's fascinating, especially to see it applied to these sites in Sichuan.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate all the questions from the audience, and thank you to you again, Julia and Chris, for the opportunity to share my work with you all.
So I want to give everybody, before we go, a brief note. Our next lecture in the Art, Environment, and Materiality Along the Silk Road series will be on February 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So that's Thursday, same day, February 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern. Our speaker will be Maria Chiara Gasparini, who is Assistant Professor of Chinese Art and Architectural History at the University of Oregon. She'll be speaking on a devotional form of art, textile development and recycling along the Silk Road. So further information on that is forthcoming. We're keeping up our theme of sustainability here, Sonya, so thank you for inaugurating that. I'd like to thank all of our viewers for joining us this evening. We, as always, greatly appreciate you and your support. Once more, a huge thank you to Sonya. This was fascinating and has given me a lot of new pathways for thinking about sites I work on and sites that I've dealt with in the past. So thank you, Sonya. And I want to wish everyone a very pleasant evening. Good night.